This is Chapter 14, Module 1, Intro to the Brain. The learning objectives of this module are 1. Name the major brain regions and describe the locations and functions of each. 2. List the ventricles and describe their locations and function. 3. Explain how the brain is protected and supported and discuss the importance of cerebral spinal fluid. And 4. Describe the anatomical differences between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord.
The brain has 4 major regions. The largest region of the adult brain is the cerebrum. The cerebrum can be divided into large, paired cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres are covered by a cerebral cortex, which is a layer of gray matter that forms a series of elevated ridges or gyri that serve to increase its surface area. The gyri are separated by shallow depressions called sulci or by deeper grooves called fissures. The cerebrum is the origin of most higher mental functions, including conscious thoughts, sensations, intellect, memory, and complex movements. We'll look more closely at the cerebrum in a different segment. The cerebellum is the second largest region of the brain that is partially hidden by the cerebral hemispheres. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has hemispheres that are covered by a layer of gray matter, the cerebellar cortex. The 2 cerebellar hemispheres are separated by a narrow vermis. In a sagittal section, the white matter of the cerebellum is apparent. This tissue is highly branched like a tree and is called the arbor vitae. The cerebellum adjusts ongoing movements, allowing you to perform the same movements over and over again. It coordinates learned and reflexive patterns of muscular activity at the subconscious level. For example, learned muscle patterns such as those involved in serving a tennis ball or playing the guitar are stored and processed in the cerebellum. The cerebellum is linked to the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum by the peduncles, the superior, middle, and inferior peduncles. The cerebellum can be permanently damaged by trauma or stroke, or temporarily damaged by drugs such as alcohol. The result is ataxia, where the muscles are not coordinated and a person may sway when walking. In severe ataxia, the individual cannot sit or stand without assistance. The diencephalon is another region of the brain. The diencephalon is a structural and functional link between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. The diencephalon is composed of the left and right thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Each thalamus helps to relay sensory information to the cerebrum. Each thalamus helps to relay ascending sensory information to the cerebrum. Ascending information from the spinal cord and the cranial nerves synapse in the right or left thalamus before reaching the cerebral cortex and our conscious awareness. It acts as a filter, passing on only a small portion of the arriving sensory information. The thalamus is the final relay station for ascending sensory information that will be projected to the primary sensory cortex of the cerebrum. The hypothalamus is the floor of the diencephalon and contains centers involved with emotions, autonomic function, and hormone production. A stalk from the hypothalamus called the infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus contains centers involved with emotions and visceral responses. It also controls a variety of autonomic functions and forms the link between the nervous and endocrine system. The hypothalamus, in company with the pituitary gland, controls the emission of hormones. The hypothalamus produces 2 hormones called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. It also produces hormones that regulate the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is in control of body temperature, maintains the blood pressure and the rate and force of the heartbeat, and controls the body's need for water and electrolytes. The maintenance of these and other changing events within normal limits is called homeostasis. This includes behavior aimed at keeping the body in a correct and thus comfortable environment. For example, it makes a person hungry or thirsty when the water or electrolyte balance is off. The hypothalamus is also the center for organizing the activity of the 2 parts of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Epithalamus is the roof of the diencephalon. The anterior portion of the epithalamus contains an extensive area of choroid plexus that produces cerebral spinal fluid. The posterior portion contains the pineal gland, an endocrine tissue that secretes the hormone melatonin. Melatonin helps to regulate the day-night cycles. Shortly before bedtime, the pineal gland will secrete melatonin, which helps to make you sleepy. Melatonin also helps to regulate reproductive functions and is a factor in determining at what age puberty will begin. The brainstem is the last region of the brain that contains the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is found just superior to the pons. It regulates auditory and visual reflexes and controls alertness. The cerebral peduncles contain descending fibers into the pons, which will then travel to the cerebellum, and descending fibers that carry voluntary motor commands issued by the cerebrum. Also found in the midbrain is an area called the reticular activating system. This region contains nuclei that process visual and auditory information and control reflexes triggered by these stimuli. It makes you more alert and attentive. If you hear a loud, unexpected noise, your eye movements and head turning are directed by the nuclei in the midbrain. The midbrain also contains centers that help to maintain consciousness. The pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. The pons contains tracts and relay centers to the cerebellum and also contains nuclei involved with motor control. The sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 are located in the pons. The pons also contains 2 respiratory centers that modify the activity of the respiratory rhythmicity center in the medulla oblongata. In other words, the pons modifies the rhythm of your breathing. The rhythm of your breathing is directly controlled by the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior portion of the brainstem that is continuous to the spinal cord. The inferior portion of the medulla oblongata resembles the spinal cord in that it has a narrow central canal. The medulla oblongata is a very busy place. All communication between the brain and spinal cord must travel through the tracts in the medulla oblongata before reaching other regions of the brain. The medulla oblongata relays sensory information to the thalamus and to centers in other portions of the brainstem. The medulla also contains major centers that regulate autonomic functions such as heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, and digestion. The medulla oblongata contains the cardiovascular and respiratory centers. The limbic system includes tissue along the border between the cerebrum and the diencephalon. This system is a functional group rather than an anatomical one, meaning there are no distinct borders. The limbic system establishes emotional states, such as rage, fear, pain, sexual arousal, and pleasure. People with damage here have difficulty getting pleasure in life, and often turn to alcohol, drugs, sweets, and gambling addictions. This area is also responsible for repetitive behaviors, reward experiences, and focusing attention. This is the area that associates memories to smells and to pain. For instance, the smell of an apple pie might make someone remember memories of their childhood. The limbic system links the conscious intellectual functions of the cerebral cortex with the unconscious and autonomic functions of the brainstem, meaning it makes your heart beat faster and you breathe faster if you see a bear and know that it is dangerous. The limbic system also facilitates memory storage and retrieval. The hippocampus is a nucleus in the floor of the lateral ventricle that is important in learning, especially in the storage and retrieval of new long-term memories. The brain is encased in layers of tough, protective cranial meninges. The cerebrospinal fluid circulated between certain meningeal layers cushions the brain and prevents it from contacting the cranial bones during a head injury, like airbags in a car prevents a passenger from hitting the dashboard. The cranial meninges are anatomically similar to and continuous with the spinal meninges of the spinal cord. The cranial meninges consist of 3 layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the outer meningeal covering consisting of 2 layers. Between the 2 layers are large blood sinuses, collectively called the dural sinuses, that drain blood from the cranial veins into the jugular veins of the neck. Between the dura mater and the underlying arachnoid mater is the subdural space. Deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater, named after the web-like connection this membrane has with the underlying pia mater. On the surface of the brain is the pia mater, which contains many blood vessels supplying the brain. Between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is the subarachnoid space, where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. The dura mater has extensions that help stabilize the brain. A mid-sagittal fold in the dura mater forms the falx cerebri and separates the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Posteriorly, the dura mater folds again as the tentorium cerebelli and separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. The falx cerebelli is a dural fold between the hemispheres of the cerebellum. Deep in the brain are 4 chambers called ventricles. 2 lateral ventricles, one in each cerebral hemisphere, extend deep into the cerebrum as horse-shaped chambers. Cerebral spinal fluid circulates from the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen and enters the 3rd ventricle. The third ventricle is a small chamber in the diencephalon. Cerebral spinal fluid in the third ventricle passes through the aqueduct of the midbrain and enters the fourth ventricle that is located between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Cerebral spinal fluid is directed to the exterior of the brain and the spinal cord and into the subarachnoid space. Cerebral spinal fluid in the third ventricle passes through the aqueduct of the midbrain and enters the fourth ventricle that is located between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Cerebral spinal fluid is directed to the exterior of the brain and the spinal cord and into the subarachnoid space. Cerebral spinal fluid then circulates around the brain and the spinal cord and is reabsorbed by arachnoid granulations, which project into the veins of the dural sinuses. Inside each ventricle is a specialized capillary called the choroid plexus, where cerebral spinal fluid is produced.
This ends Chapter 14, Module 1, Intro to the Brain.